Welcome. Bienvenue à Montréal.
Merci beaucoup. Je suis ravi d'être ici encore à Montréal.
À Montréal.
Une vie belle et magnifique.
Je suis d'accord avec vous. As you know, I'm a newly elected member of parliament representing part of this beautiful island of Montreal. So I'm also very happy to welcome you all to this city and back to Global Progress here in Montreal. I hope everyone's having a great day. I caught the tail end of Mark's remarks there, and there's lots to think about, as usual at Global Progress conferences. So Tony, I think we could start with a little bit about your institute. Obviously, folks in this room are very familiar with your time as Prime Minister and your engagement globally since then, but the Institute was instrumental in helping us deliver this conference today, among other things. So perhaps you could give us a little sense of what the work is there that you're doing.
Yeah, sure. And again, thank you very much indeed for having me here. So the Institute was really born out of my time as Prime Minister, because I found the hardest thing about government was getting anything done.
Great.
And, I used to think, but I was brought up in the Labour Party believing that the system was basically a conservative conspiracy. And when I finally got there into number 10 Downing Street, I discovered it really wasn't a conspiracy for either Conservative or Labour. It was a conspiracy for inertia, effectively, and a very successful one. So I learned a whole lot of lessons during my time as Prime Minister. And, one of the ironies of being in government is that politics is a weird profession, because it's the only profession in the world where you take a really important job and put into it someone with no qualifications at all. I mean, my first job was Prime Minister of the UK, right? This was my first job in politics, proper job, as it were. I mean, okay, I'd be leader of the opposition, but this is, your first proper job. And of course, the paradox is that you start at your most popular and least capable. And then you end, differently. Because by the end of the 10 years, you think, look, guys, I can do this job now. You should really, let me just get on with it. So what the Institute is really based on, what are the lessons in government? Because people face the same problems all over the world today. So, if you're talking about a cost of living crisis, the problems of housing, the problems of migration, I mean, you could go virtually any country in the Western world, and it's a similar set of problems. So what we try to do is we work on delivery, right? Strategy, policy, delivery, particularly enabled by technology, which we'll come to in a minute, no doubt. But the delivery side of it is all about prioritizing, getting the right policy in place, building the right team, and then making sure you implement. And that is a tough thing to do. Mm-hmm. So we have teams of people who go and live and work alongside the leaders in countries, mainly in the developing world, but now in roughly 40 different countries around the world. And, we'll, by the end of this year, have almost 1,000 people in the Institute. We've got a large policy side as well, because the other thing about politics that I learned is that, one level, politics is quite crude. Mm-hmm. You've just done your by-election, so it's about shaking hands, knocking on doors, coming out with the right slogans. But actually, policy is a tough intellectual business. Mm-hmm. And getting the right answer is hard. And so we combine these two things, advising governments, and then on the policy side. And the other thing is we work on the agenda for progressive politics, because, the challenge for me always with progressive politics is that if you're not careful, you face a choice between policies that are radical but not sensible, or sensible but not radical. Mm-hmm. And on the one hand, the policies that are sensible but not radical, people lack enthusiasm. And the ones that are radical but not sensible tend to result in defeat. So yeah, that's what we do. But it's all about helping government leaders with the business of governing.
That's very interesting. So you talk about advising political leadership, and you touch a little bit on the role of technology in the work of the Institute. So AI is obviously on everyone's mind these days. So when you advise government about the impact of technology in these other countries and really around the world, what are the politics of that these days?
So what was really interesting, we did a paper on this actually from the Institute, which Ben, who was here earlier today, did for us. There was an analysis of the 19th century Industrial Revolution and how long it took politics to catch up. Right? And the answer is it took decades. For years and years, the political debates in the UK Parliament were just carrying on as if we were still in the 18th century, but actually we were in a century of enormous technological innovation and advance. And we're living through now a 21st century technology revolution, which is every bit as dramatic. And I think the problem is that you've often got the policymakers, people in government, and the change makers, the people introducing and developing and inventing the new technologies, and they don't have a big dialogue together. And yet this technology revolution, I think, is going to change everything. And it's entered a new phase just recently, where a whole lot of things have come together in what I would call a kind of permanent reinforcement loop of innovation and change. And particularly with artificial intelligence, this next iteration of artificial intelligence is completely revolutionary. And in my view, the mission for progressive politics now in the third decade of the 21st century is to understand this revolution, master it, and harness it. Mitigating its risks, because it's general purpose technology, it can be used for harm as well as good, but embracing the huge changes that can be made as a result of it. And, I still find when I'm having conversations with people in politics today, that you will talk about this and then they'll say, yeah, no, that's interesting. Now let's talk about politics. But I think we really need to, this is the mission.
Right.
And it's going to offer enormous opportunities as well as the risks. But the thing that is clear is it's going to happen and it's going to bring about fundamental change. And the question is, can government get its head around that?
That's a very good question.
Well, it can. But you've first of all got to accept that it is a fact.
Yeah.
And you need to understand it and master it.
So you're optimistic.
I'm optimistic because I'm optimistic because it can bring enormous advances. Right. Look, it's going to revolutionize healthcare. It can revolutionize education. If you think about government, right, the 19th century state was a small state, was a minimalist state. Government didn't have a lot of power to do much for people. Right. Then the 20th century saw the growth of the modern state, which does a lot, which takes up 40% of the national income or more of most developed countries today. And that state has grown in size. It's responsible for public services, it's responsible for welfare systems, but I think it's creaking at the seams, right? It's not working very well.
Right.
People are spending more and more. Taxes can be quite high, but we're not really getting the results that we require. And this technology revolution offers us the chance for a 21st century state that is strategic, where you're doing things completely differently as a result of the ability, for example, in your healthcare system, to shift from curing disease to preventing it. There's a revolution available to you in terms of diagnosis, in terms of genetics, in terms of all the things that can allow you to give people the power to control their own health, to interact much more easily with the healthcare system. Now, to do that, you need a proper digital infrastructure in a country. Personally, I think most countries will move towards some form of digital identifier or digital ID. I think that's inevitable, that's going to happen. But this is, for good and for bad, this revolution is with us, and how we approach it, I think, is the biggest challenge for us.
Do you see countries leading on this or well-positioned to take advantage of this at this point in time?
Yeah, I think there are countries that are setting themselves up to do this well. Actually, sometimes it's often smaller countries. Probably the most technologically advanced country in Europe in terms of this and government is the small country of Estonia.
Yeah.
And then you've got, other countries. But you take a large country like India, with its ADAR system, its digital ID system, has had a transformative effect on the ability of citizens to interact with government. So I think, this is, because it is, the challenge for progressive politics at the moment is when budgets are under pressure, and Mark was just talking about the fiscal discipline and so on. When budgets are under pressure, when families feel that their incomes aren't rising in real terms, the challenge for progressive politics is you can default either to quite an old-fashioned view of sort of left policy, which is just more tax, more spending. Okay, that's got one set of risks. You can default to a new type of progressive politics, which is around identity. But I think that also has big risks because the right wing can play that game and often play it more successfully than the left. And so, the question is, what is it that is a unifying message for a country where you need an active government, which is always the hallmark of the progressives, because they believe in the power of government to be able to help people and to empower them. That's the 21st century mission for progressive politics, in my view. And anything else is going to be secondary to the real world event of that revolution.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, but the potential, I agree, is there. I mean, I think what we also see, and you sort of mentioned it a little bit, is the potential for the right. What we're seeing is a bit of this rise of populism in many parts of the world, coming from this place of anxiety, but it's being fueled also by the technology and the technological revolution, the capacity to spread messages and to provoke and influence debate in countries where you may not even be located, but you're interfering from other borders. How do we respond to that anxiety and try to really lean on the positive side of the opportunity in this equation?
Well, there are two separate things. I mean, there's first of all the use of technology to disrupt the democratic process, and you've got to get after that and deal with it as best you can. The secondly, people's fears about technology. But my point is, if you're having that debate, you're in a place which is a real world debate and which progressives have got a good argument. And the thing with populism, because, it's populism to me is, you've got to be careful as to how you define it, right? Populism is not politicians wanting to be popular, because I think that's quite a general sentiment. Populism to me is when, rather than try and deal with the grievance, you exploit it. Right. And you exploit it, you ride the anger rather than provide the answer. Right. Now, in my view, populism does not usually invent the grievance, it exploits it. And the challenge for progressives is you've got to recognize the grievance exists and deal with it. And you've got to be prepared. I think we were saying this before we came in here. I was saying politics, you always get to decide the answer, but you don't always get to decide the question. Right. So if, for example, the public is posing to you a question on immigration, in Canada, it's a different type of debate, but if they're posing that question to you, you've got to be able to answer it. If you don't have an answer for it, you're going to be in trouble. And likewise with anything that affects personal security, crime or antisocial behavior. So I always think it's really important for the progressives to be in a position where they've got an answer. If you don't have an answer, then that's when the populists succeed. And it's also important always for progressive parties to stay competitive. Because, our populist moment was the Brexit vote.
Yes.
And, I mean, go into all of that. But one thing that I think is not so much appreciated about that was that might be one of the reasons it happened was because we didn't have a credible leadership of the Labour Party at that time. Had we had a credible leadership, like the leadership we got today, frankly, we would have had someone who was able to go into Labour areas and explain why they would be not sensible to vote for Brexit.
Right.
And therefore, one of the things that's always important for progressive parties is even if you're out of power, you've got to remain competitive. But to remain competitive in a world where populism is, and it's fueled by social media, of course,
right.
You've got to be prepared to answer the difficult questions even when it hurts to do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and sometimes we want to talk about the things that are not necessarily connected to what folks are worried about, like the policy or the idea that we think is important is not necessarily reflective of the anxiety or the source of the anxiety in a way that matches. And I think for those of you who were here early, you weren't here in the first presentation on the research this morning, but we talked about Marcus and Hans and Amy about those messages and how to be ready to answer those questions. And it seems to be a constant theme at these conversations of meeting that message, of finding that message and meeting that anxiety with a progressive lens and not being distracted by the populism or the message of that is distracting us. Even though the issue is there is a real issue behind that stress.
And that's why you've got to be prepared to deal with it. And I also think, in the end, look, it's you've got to have a strategy for your campaigning, which has a play for defense against the issues where you may be vulnerable or where the public may not naturally believe that you're the best people to deal with an issue. And then obviously you've got your offensive play, but you've got to, you can't win the match if you let in the goals.
Indeed. We play a lot of hockey here too. We know a little bit about that.
Don't ask me about hockey.
I won't ask you about hockey.
Yeah.
So look, we just at the outset we talked about how I'm a newly elected member of parliament to a party that has been in government 8 years here in Canada. And when you were 8 years in power amidst, I would say, challenging domestic and global issues, you won a third majority government. And how did you do that at that time? I'd like to know.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, my thing is always you got to be the person with the plan.
Yeah.
I think I sometimes say it's like driving the bus, right? If you're driving the bus at a reasonable speed, right? So you're moving along. The passengers are all complaining, by the way. They're all sitting there saying, well, I don't know, you should have taken that turning, and that doesn't look too good to me, and where are we going exactly, and blah, blah, blah. But they know they're going, right? Mm-hmm. They're moving. You slow down, or worse, you stop the bus. You never get back on again, right? Because they're all, then they decide just pull you out of the driver's seat with someone else in. So you've got to be the person with the plan. Mm-hmm. And we were, when you're going several years in, you're not going to have the same enthusiasm as you did first time around, and that's just the way of it. I remember on the first night of getting elected, those years ago, there was massive enthusiasm, and I think I was one of the very few sober people in the entire Labour Party, because I was kind of thinking of the responsibility of governing. And I remember someone coming up to me and saying, as people do in these. Oh, it's fantastic, Tony, now everything is possible. And I was like what? I mean, everything's fine. So it's not real when that happens.
Right.
And therefore, as you carry on governing, okay, you're taking tough decisions. When you decide, you divide, it's always going to be difficult. But in the end, if you have a clarity of direction, right, when you come into your later elections, they're not going to elect you because they love you, but they may elect you because they think there is a clear direction, mm-hmm. and they prefer that direction to what is on offer from the alternative. And I do think it's that, I always used to say to people that the only time I would ever get frightened is if I saw a better idea coming at me than the one that I had. Now, maybe I was completely wrong in thinking it, but I didn't think that when we fought that third election. I thought, no, we've got purpose, we've got drive, we know what we're doing. Yes, of course, there are all sorts of things that are really difficult for us. But I think that's my view is it's because people the electorate And I think this is particularly true in an era of social media. I mean, social media wasn't really a factor when I was in office. And I really sympathize with political leaders who are operating in this environment today, because one of the first things that you learn about politics is that those that shout loudest don't deserve to be heard most, right? Yes. But that's not social media, right? They're shouting all the time, right? It's the platform with the loudmouth, frankly, I mean, to be honest. And it's a bit of a plague on modern politics as a result of that. But here's the paradox. At the same time as the public is engaged in it and is, making a lot of noise around the political leaders, they actually look for leaders that stand firm against that. Because in their heart of hearts, whilst they may even indulge in it themselves, they still distrust it. They know what it is and what it isn't. And I do think that's why if you've got a plan and you're prepared to be really tough about it, I think people do follow that. At least, I found they did at that point in time.
The authenticity and the values.
Well, it
come through.
Yeah, because in the end, then you're there is a direction and there's momentum.
Yeah. Well, I think I see about a minute left on our clock, but I think I would just like to thank you again for being here and for participating and for contributing through your institute to the work that's going on here today at Global Progress and around the world. It's truly
and your Parliament first thing
Monday. Yes.
Good luck.
Thank you. Thanks, Jordan.